Well, welcome everyone to this Youth Specialties Hangout on Air. My name is Jacob Eckeberger, and I'm on staff with YS, and I have the privilege of connecting with youth workers from all across the U.S. who can share their experience to help us navigate some essential, but also some not so comfortable conversations. And today we're focusing on helping youth workers begin conversations about immigration and refugee resettlement with their students and leaders. And right off the bat, I want to acknowledge that this is a massive conversation, one that we cannot cover in a day or that we can even pretend to be experts on. All we can do is set the table to encourage people to share some of their own stories and then lean into them so that we can see where God might lead us in the process. So we're going to be leaning into Nate, Christina, and Annie, who is on the legal side of things much more of an expert than the rest of us. But I'm glad that she's a part of this conversation. Nate and Christina are fantastic youth workers serving in different ministries and in some really special ways. So I want to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. So we'll go around the virtual room. And Nate, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, right on. So my name is Nate Severson, and I'm a youth pastor at Hillcrest Covenant Church in Overland Park, Kansas. And so I've had the privilege of just partnering with different organizations, and it's awesome and kind of an honor to be here with you, Specialties, and a part of this conversation. I do want to say right off the bat, I'm not an expert on everything that we're saying here, so I'm excited to learn from everyone as well. I think that's going to be really fantastic. The way I was introduced to the conversation, I had an incredible just experience last summer with some people from our church. We took an intergenerational missions trip with some of our youth and adults to Athens, Greece, to partner with a church that connects with refugees all over the Athens area, actually all over Europe. And we were asked to go to Greece. And so the way everything kind of started out for us was we actually spent our first few days in Amsterdam, partnering with all sorts of different groups that were going to be working with refugees all over Europe. And we spent 3 days in Amsterdam. Just really, most of our time was spent just kind of working on our soul more than anything, hanging out with Jesus and getting focused in the right direction. But also a lot of our time was spent learning about the people that we're going to be connecting with and linking arms with, a lot of the refugees that were in the different communities we were heading to, including Athens. So my team and myself, when we were in Athens, we spent the majority of our time at the port of Athens. And at the port of Athens was it was almost like a temporary place where refugees that landed in Greece were placed there temporarily. And so our group would daily go down, and a lot of the time that we spent in Athens and at the port was just connected with people in their different places where they were temporarily staying. A lot of it was there's thousands of tents everywhere, and we were just encouraged to just kind of walk and kind of walk through the tent cities. And we honestly, like, for me, it was this eye-opening experience of just kind of walking through and being invited to just sit with people and to enter into their story with them. And for me, that was one of the more powerful experiences because just you met these different people and you got to hear their stories and just connect with them on a super deep level. For me, it opened my eyes to a lot of things, and a lot of it was just a relationship with people that I didn't know. So that was amazing. And through just hearing different people's stories, God really just did some things in my life and certainly the lives of the others, and maybe even just in general with some of the different stories that we heard and how God used those stories to open up deeper conversations. Our goal wasn't to convert people when we were talking with them. It was just to be their friends and to, like I said, enter into their story as best as we could. But what we found was through just hearing their stories, they want to know our stories. And so we were able to share our stories. And through doing that, God opened up a lot of just really awesome conversations. And by the time our time in Athens was done, we were talking to a lot of the people, and some of the comments that we heard, again, like, was powerful. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things. One of the groups of people that we spent a lot of time with were some men from Afghanistan that were forced out of Afghanistan because of the Taliban. And so when we were spending time with these guys, one of the things that they told us was, or we asked them the question, what do you want us to tell people when we get back to America about the time that we spent here in Greece? And a couple of the guys said, they said two things. They said, number one, we saw a side of Jesus that we hadn't ever seen or experienced before, which really kind of opened our eyes. But then the second thing they said that really stood out to me was, you made us feel like we're humans again. And again, like, for me, that kind of broke me down a little bit, because, you know, when you hear their stories and you hear a lot of the people that we spent time with, they didn't feel like they're humans anymore. And they felt like they were just kind of living a life that they didn't want to live, and even the life that they weren't created to live. And so at that moment, like, for me, it was like this moment where, like, God really spoke to me about my life. And I got to see some things about my life through the eyes of the refugees that we're spending time with. And one of the things that God really said to me and spoke to me, and I think to our group, was that, you know, what we do on a global level needs to translate to a local level. That we're not just there to have an experience in Greece and to partner with people there and then come home and nothing changes, but to connect what we do globally to what we do locally. And so as a youth pastor, I really felt convicted about that. We've gone on a lot of mission trips, and we've connected with people in a lot of different communities. And to be honest, like, I think it's a weakness of ours, is connecting what we do globally to the locally. And so when I came back, I wanted to make sure that that we did what we're convicted about doing, connecting what we do globally to what we do locally. And so thankfully, we have actually a great relationship with a lady that goes to our church who used to be a refugee from Iran. And we were actually, as a ministry, able to partner with her when we came back, and connect with her and what she does locally with refugees here in Kansas City. And man, it has been literally, I've been a youth pastor for 20 years. It's been one of the best things I've ever experienced as a youth pastor. And what I mean by that is, like, the opportunity to just walk through life with our brothers and sisters that are right here in Kansas City, to enter into a relationship with them. Not so that we can gain something from that relationship, but just so that we can link arms and be brothers and sisters with our friends that are here. And so we on a monthly basis are connecting our youth and a lot of the families in our church to a lot of the relationships that our friend Tali has with local refugees around the community. We open the doors of our church to them and connect with them at our church, but we also go to their homes and spend time in their homes and encourage them, to come alongside of them, to support them. It's been amazing. And again, like, our goal isn't to gain anything or to use them so we can feel better about ourselves, but our goal is to just link arms with them as our friends, to welcome them into our community, and to support them as best as we possibly can. It's been literally one of those things that I know I can speak for our youth and our leaders and the families in our church, is something that I think is changing our church in a really, really good way. We're hearing stories of people that they're inviting us to enter into that story with them as best as we can. I mean, obviously, a lot of the stuff that they share are things that we can't really relate to because we've not experienced what they've experienced. But man, we can certainly, through just being with them, like I said, enter into their story as best as we possibly can and encourage them. And just be a part of that. So that's kind of just a quick overview of kind of what's been going on here. But again, you know, for me, the biggest thing was what we did globally needs to connect locally, and it's been amazing.
I will go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Suos, and I am an associate pastor at the Minneapolis Cambodian Church in Minnesota. I work with young adults ministries and with youth as well. And so, like Nate was saying, I by no means am a expert on this sort of thing, but my experience comes from growing up in a church primarily made up of immigrant and refugee families. And so like Nate was saying, he talked about stories. And when we think of families, like any family, every family has a story. And so in order to really understand my context, I think it would be nice to just kind of go back to the story of the people that I've worked with. And so he is the Cambodian community. So they came from Cambodia. And what happened was between 1975 and 79, there was a war going on. In 79, the communists took over the country, and that's when the mass killing began. During those 4 years, nearly 2 million people died out of 7 million. So it's quite a, if you think about it, every family was affected, including my own. People that they knew behind and just kind of flee. And so that meant living in places that they didn't think that they would live. They had to go live in the fields, work in the fields. And they were forced to do hard manual labor, lived in very meager settings. And so people had to make a decision for themselves. What were they going to do to survive? And that meant leaving the country. And so what happened was that they were going to leave to their neighboring country, which was Thailand. When they got to Thailand, they lived in refugee camps. And once there, the UN classified Cambodians as refugees. So people started to put in applications to go to different countries, and then began, that long process. And it took several steps before they could actually make it to US immigration, before they said, okay, here, you guys are going to be able to leave. And so the UN started looking at backgrounds, started getting into connections with different organizations in the US to see if they would be able to sponsor families. And if you had families that were already in the US, then you would be able to come a little bit more easily. If you didn't, then you would have to go to places such as Malaysia or the Philippines to start kind of like a how-to process. This is where you learn how to speak English. This is where you learn how to ride the bus, or, they did screenings as well, health screenings there. And then once everything passed, then they came to the US or whatever country they went to. So some went to France, some went to, just various different countries. And so that's kind of how it all started. People didn't want to leave their country, but they had to leave in order to survive. That was the only way that they would be able to really make it out alive. And so now you have refugees, immigrants in the US. What should happen now? And, as a church, or as people in general, we would think, okay, life, they're here now, life is going to be easy, and always the case. Obviously, there were clashes between the new culture, the former culture. What do we do now? To what extent do we, try to fit in, but while at the same time keeping our heritage with us? So that was a big issue. And then along with that, so you had the clash with so the former culture, the new culture, and then there were internal clashes within families as well. So we're talking about, if you're a youth worker, you're thinking, oh, come to church, everything will be fine, that sort of thing. Well, and that there were clashes between families and children as well, because children oftentimes wanted to completely forget or completely put away their old ways of living and just kind of begin, there's this new life that, parents were saying, hey, you have to remember this, remember what happened. So there was, external clashes, internal clashes as well. And so those are just some things to think about as you're working with immigrant and refugee families that are new to the country. Be sensitive to, I guess, the parent and children dynamics is something that I would recommend. And then also I would say that when it comes to ethnic groups, people within those certain groups probably make the most effect. So when you think of immigrant communities, you often see that people kind of congregate with one another. That's because, when you meet families that have come before, it's kind of been like they've been there before, they've been there, they've done that, they know what to do, here are the ropes. And so what we can do is, oftentimes help them get associated with those groups. And as a church or people on the outside can help as well, obviously. But just keep in mind that people within an ethnic group tend to be more effective if we can help them get in contact with those groups as well. And then just in thinking about, I guess, as a church working with immigrants and refugees, there's been ups and downs. And in recent days, we've had to deal with deportation. That's been an issue. We've had to help families with, naturalization processes. And so there's all sorts of things that, we as a community can help out. It's just a matter of helping people really connect with the right resources and really just being sensitive to the needs of people. And not all stories are the same. You think maybe everybody has similar stories, but there's just a vast variety of that just doesn't always fit with every single immigrant group or refugee group. So just keep that in mind as well. And there's so much more to really say, and I'm sure that we'll discuss it. But if there's any questions, I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Well, thank you so much, both Christina and Nate, for sharing your perspectives, because I think it's important for us to remember, just like what I said before, that this is a massive conversation and one that has been discussed and gone over long before President Trump's recent executive order. And if I'm being honest, there's a lot about the executive order that I don't understand. So Annie is one of those professionals in this field that we want to lean into to at least help us set the table for understanding the essentials of what we need to do, how we need to engage in this stuff. And before we do that, I also want to mention just a couple of things. Remembering that, in the spirit of Mike Yaconelli, YS is still a place that sees incredible value in the big tent, being more about the and than the either or. And it's especially difficult to maintain that in conversations that tend to be polarizing. So when we get into some of these conversations about the legal aspect of it, and Annie helps us set the table for it, know that our intention is not to pick one side politically or the other. Our intention is literally to help us understand how much we don't know in all of this stuff, and then in turn, how do we flip that and understand that the second important thing is that in times like this, we as youth workers, regardless of any executive order, of any political move, anything, we are called to help teens find and follow Jesus and disciple them to live out the love and work of God. And that's the basics, right? That's what our calling is and will always be. That will never change. And I'm grateful that Nate and Christina shared from their experience so that we can sort of put some flesh and bone around how that might look for various youth workers. But all that to say, again, we are not experts in this topic. And so Annie, could you give us, from a legal perspective, even the basics of the difference between immigrant populations and refugee populations and refugee resettlement, and then kind of help us understand some of those high-level points of the executive order?
Sure. So Annie Rice, and I am an immigration attorney in St. Louis, Missouri. And we are a refugee resettlement city here in St. Louis, and so that means that we are contracted with the Department of State to receive refugees here. And so we are a city that has been rebuilt in a lot of ways by immigrant populations. It's the fastest growing population in our city, which is quite cool. So what I want to say, so immigration law, my legal book on this is about yay big, and that's just the law, not cases and interpretation. That's just the law. So this is a big concept to try to sort of understand. So the main differences, the three main ways that you legally come into the United States are immigration through family, immigration through business, and then humanitarian immigration. So your refugee asylum populations. So leaving off the family and the business, because that's a whole nother aspect. Let's talk about refugees and asylees. The refugee admissions, the government says that the United States is proud of its history of welcoming immigrants and refugees, and the Refugee Resettlement Program reflects the United States' highest values and aspirations to compassion, generosity, and leadership. So the US has welcomed 3 million refugees since the 1970s. There are 21.3 million refugees in the world today. So and last year, the US admitted between 85,000 and 110,000 refugees. So we are taking a very small piece of what exists in the world. And it's not just refugees in the Middle East. There are refugees all over the world in all sorts of internal conflicts in their countries and external. But what it is basically it's our humanitarian aspect. It was our refugee program came into place after World War II, when we had turned around refuge-seeking people who were fleeing from Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied other territories. It was actually the ship was named the St. Louis that the United States turned around and sent back. And we do know that more than 200, I believe it was around 300 of those refugees that we sent back were eventually killed in concentration camps. And the US said, we're never doing this again, right? A lot of people said a lot of things after World War II, we're never going to do this again. And so we developed this policy of accepting refugees. What it means is that a person has a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And that's the whole, that last part is tricky. But focusing on what the people in camps, the actually settling refugees in the United States, start off in camps. They are UN-sanctioned camps. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees is over all of these camps, and they go through 18 months to 2 years of processing. They apply, so you have to get to the camp first. You have to get to somewhere where the government can find you. You have to apply for these programs, be screened by the UN first, and then if you're designated to the United States, you don't get to choose whether or not you come to the US, but if you have family here, then you kind of get a higher priority of being resettled in the US. But it's not something that, if I was just a person who had no ties to the US, who was living in Syria and made it to a camp and said, I really want to be in the US, they don't have to honor that. So you get placed here if you have family here and you have connections, because they're trying to keep family groups together, and you're more likely to thrive if you're with a community group that you knew before. But so the UN clears you and sends a very small piece to the US Department of State to process. Then we take over processing. The FBI, the Department of State, you have biometrics processing, so your fingerprints, your photo, they run background checks. This is 2 years of screening before they're given permission to fly to the US. And once they're here, the Department of State contracts with agencies in particular cities to receive the refugees and give them a very short amount of time of financial assistance. It's 3 months to 6 months max that actually comes from the US government. Otherwise, so people who don't speak English, who may have very few ties to the community, are expected to be able to support themselves in the United States within 3 to 6 months of arriving. So it's a very traumatic, a very abrupt, it just significant transition for those families. So that's why the on-the-ground help is so necessary for those populations incoming. So moving to the executive order that was issued, President Trump identified 7 countries for more specific screening, higher screening for people from those countries. We know now that that does not include people, well, dual citizens. So if someone has a Syrian and a Canadian passport, if they're traveling on their Canadian passport, they are not supposed to be turned around. But we're having problems with enforcement of these things as well. But then also halting the refugee resettlement program in its entirety. So not just specific to Syrian refugees, but in its entirety, halting refugee admissions to the U.S. For a set period of time, and then Syrian refugees indefinitely. And so that is all it's all halted at the moment. There is a lawsuit in Washington state, and there are several states that have sued. Hawaii has sued, Washington state has sued the federal government, saying that this is an unconstitutional act by the president to halt all these things on the basis of nationality. We don't need to get into the legal argument of whether or not that's going to be valid. The judges will figure that out. But at the moment, they said the temporary restraining order, making it so that they cannot enforce that executive action, is in place. So refugees are now coming into the United States again. People who were turned around at the airports are being invited to re-enter. However, this is sort of a day-by-day, moment-by-moment world that we're living in at the moment. People are boarding planes, and then a court decision will come down and they'll be detained again, or another court decision will come down and say, okay, get back on the plane, come back in. You can come into Boston, but not into Washington, D.C. You can. So at the moment, though, that executive action is not being enforced anywhere in the United States because of that judge's temporary restraining order in Washington state. So that is sort of the big picture. Jacob, I don't know if you want to take over now with questions. It might be easier to sort of direct things.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, Annie, I really appreciate you trying to distill all of that information. I know it's not easy. When I think about, ultimately, this is something that each of us recognize as just one more call that we need to be living for the marginalized and connecting with those who are being oppressed. And because of the recent executive order stuff, this is immigration populations and refugee populations are the ones that people are talking about the most right now. And so I would love to, just from a youth worker's perspective, thinking about ways in which your worlds have changed when you have connected with the flesh and bone of the marginalized. Would you mind sharing a little bit about how it is, both Nate, Christina, and Annie as well? I know that you've got a background in working with students too. Would you all mind sharing just a little bit about how, when you have connected with the marginalized, how it has changed your perspective on ministry, the way in which you do things? Because I think we can learn. And right now, especially, I think we need to learn from each other on kind of best examples of these things. So y'all take it away.
Well, I'll go ahead and say something.
Perfect. I think you're muted. Just say.
We just had. Hello?
Sorry, Christina. I interrupted you. You go for it.
Okay, sure. I think we just have to remember that the way that we handle refugees and immigrants kind of hurts our witness to those who are maybe on the fringe of Christianity, because the church is being so closely watched right now, and compassion is a responsibility that's held by all, especially the church. Even in recent, days, weeks, months, we've had instances where I've had people from other countries, non-Christians, come up and say, you know, I read this Facebook post by this person. I thought he was a Christian. And what he said was so hurtful. Like, do all Christians believe that? And, you know, it just kind of breaks my heart to even hear somebody have to ask a question like that, you know? And so if we just kind of remember that, you know, these maybe blanket statements that we make may seem generalized to certain people, but for others, it's very personal, you know? And it means something, and just to kind of be aware of that issue. And then also, one thing that I've kind of come in contact with is that I've had somebody who is in like a small group, dominantly made up of white Christians, and she is not white. And, you know, her friends happen to agree with, you know, some of these executive orders that's being put out there, and they're openly saying it around her. And so she's like, it makes her sad to think that somebody would think that, and especially since she herself is, you know, comes from an immigrant family. And so she asked, I wonder what they're thinking about me. Like, do they hold these like ill feelings towards me as well? And I kind of had to remind her that, so much a part of the group that they don't even think any differently of her, which is a good thing, but a bad thing at the same time. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm including you, and you're part of my life, and you're part of my group, but I'm saying these things that just kind of doesn't make sense to her right now. And so I would just suggest that, you know, people just kind of be aware, especially around our youth. You know, we're talking about youth ministry, who are so, you know, youth, their minds change all the time, right? And one day they're strong and they're there, and, you know, they're Christian, and then something happens and all of a sudden they're on the fence about it. And so, like I said, you know, the way that we handle and immigrants really can make an impact on the witness that we have for those who maybe are on the fringe of Christianity. And I would just say, just keep that in mind as you're moving forward and working with people.
Yeah, for us, so we've had the privilege of, I mentioned in the intro, to connect with a woman in our church. Her name's Tali. And Tali at one point was a refugee from Iran who was sent to Kansas City and met her husband here and started a ministry to refugees. And so, like, she's a part of our church. And so one of the postures that we've taken as a church is to really just come alongside Tali and say, Tali, we're not here to tell you how we're going to do things for you, but you tell us like how we can support your ministry, and really kind of just letting her guide us through ways that we can come alongside of her. And honestly, that's been really helpful, because I think, like a lot of us, as I said, I'm not an expert on this. Tali is. She's lived it. She lives it still in some respects. When you know, she does a lot of the stuff she does is just it's amazing stuff. But she has been a voice to our ministry that has been so critical, and so that's been really helpful for us, and I'm really thankful for that. And even like when she's coached our youth and our adults on how to, like, what does it look like for us to partner with her ministry? What does it look like us to even just culturally, like, care for the people that we are, like I said, linking arms with, and that, I mean, critical stuff that we would walk into and probably make a lot of mistakes, and we probably do sometimes, but hopefully that's minimized because of someone like Tali who's coming alongside of us and certainly helping us. And I'll say one more thing is, you know, as a youth pastor, I hear a lot of times kids, I think because of fear and different reasons, give excuses on why they don't feel, like I hear the phrase, you know, well, I don't know, I just don't really feel called to do that. And for me, like the challenge is not whether or not we're called or not, or even the question's not whether or not we're called or not. I don't think that's the case, because I think scriptures said that we're commissioned to do it. So it's not about whether or not we're called. We're commissioned to do it. And so let's go and let's come alongside and do what Jesus has told us to do, not sitting around using the excuse, well, I don't know if I'm called or not. The reality is that we're commissioned, and so let's go and do that. And you mentioned Yakinelli, and I love Yakinelli. He's one of my heroes, and I know he started Youth Specialties, and he used to always talk about how Jesus ruined his life, and he meant that, I think, in really good terms, where he experienced things with Jesus that he was never going to forget, and it ruined him in a really, really good way. For us, we've had the privilege of, my life has been ruined forever because of Jesus. And I think a lot of our students and adults have been ruined in a really, really good way because of what God has done. And again, it's not because we're using the people that we're partnering with so that we can, get something or feel good about ourselves, but we're coming alongside of people, and we're seeing, I think, a face of Jesus and the way he interacted with people and the way he connected with people and the example I think he set for us. So as a church, man, this is like an incredible opportunity for us to shine and to live into the call and the commissioning more than anything that God has put on our life. So.
Sure. So I'll jump in here. My undergrad degree is in urban and cross-cultural ministry. So I did intend to be of service to the world through the Christian faith. That was my goal in undergrad, and I ended up finding myself in the legal profession and doing this work of serving the immigrant population. I feel like is very much a living out of that. And I will say, without you having to learn immigration law, right? When you encounter someone on the street, there is no way for you to know how they got here, why they're here, if they came the right way or they came a different way, and what is the right way and what's the wrong way to come to the US. And my goal, and what I'm seeing a lot here, my neighborhood is very immigrant heavy. We have more diverse restaurants than Epcot does. And it's a wonderful place to be. And my neighbors are coming out and just embracing the humanity of the people around them. And I think that should be the goal, is to figure out who they are or why they're here or how they got here. But just, you are a human being who is beloved by God, and we are here to be in community with you. And there is so much fear in the immigrant community right now, because not only is there this refugee ban, but there was another executive order signed that says that the federal government will be stepping up enforcement to the levels that we haven't seen since the Bush era, and they're talking about workplace raids again, and just some stuff that is very scary, even for people who do have legal status, who get caught up in things as small as running a stop sign. So we're recommending, from a legal perspective, for people to carry their proof of residency here in the United States with them, but never their foreign passports, because we don't want people to be able to be removed from the United States very quickly. But even just in that, I'm sure that you can hear the terror that would come with having to prove that you belong here in the United States everywhere you go. That people are, even in my diverse community, we're still finding swastikas drawn in places. People are, a woman who was wearing a hijab, that was attempted to be pulled from her head just at a bus stop. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and without even having to understand the legal perspective of these things, it's just embracing their humanity, loving them and caring for them, and trying to be a safe place. Just being welcoming, inviting people into your homes for dinner, inviting people to your churches for potlucks. We're seeing lots of that happening that is really great. And yeah, anyway, so just humanity.
Yeah. So if we had to, just for the sake of like trying to sum up some practical steps, if there was a youth worker who, honestly, it's probably a lot like me, does not have a lot of background in immigration issues or refugee populations or any of that stuff, where do we start? If you had to name like the first few steps of things to do, the first thing I always feel like is to choose to listen and to seek out understanding first, empathizing. That idea, recognizing that we do not understand someone else's worldview or perspective, so we have to submit to letting them own that, right? And see how we can learn from that. But outside of that, if y'all could put some practical like language around what is step 2 and what's step 3, how do we help youth workers start to engage or just begin the process of learning how to engage in these conversations?
I'll jump in just quickly and say, one of the things, because of sort of the culture of fear that is surrounding immigrants right now, is to be careful not to make them identify who they are, where they're from, what their immigration status is. Asking someone about that is probably a very fear-inducing thing right now. So would just be to encounter people as your fellow human, assume that they're an American citizen, and go from there. You know, don't. You can ask about families and things like that, but I wouldn't ask about immigration status. But then from there, I'm sure that there are organizations in cities that are serving immigrant populations. So Catholic Charities has an immigration law project, and I know that they're kind of all around the country. There are refugee resettlement agencies. So if your city is a place where there is a significant, specifically refugee population, then there is an organization that is contracted with the Department of State to bring those people in. So volunteering with them, they always have need of donations, household items. They're setting these people up with a brand new home, those sorts of things. And then volunteering English classes and helping them on their path towards becoming an American citizen is teaching English, partnering with people for jobs, especially for women who are from cultures who don't let them outside of the home or don't let them be in areas with men in public. Having women go into their homes to teach them English and to be present with them, those things are really helpful. And I have a list of organizations in St. Louis, but trying to connect with, find out who people are going to for help, asking them, you know, what agencies are helping you and how can we contribute to those?
I think a couple things. Number one, I mean, like I said before, we're really lucky in some respects to have someone like Tali, who's connected to an incredible ministry that comes alongside of people and helps them in many ways. And Tali's really Tali's done a great job, as Annie had mentioned. You know, a lot of the refugees that come to our communities, they only have, you know, like in Kansas City, a lot of them have 90 days, and so when they land and when they're here. After 90 days, there's a lot of struggle, and you don't know the language. And I think a lot of times we forget that they're coming from like really hard situations. You know, I mean, there's one guy that we're connected to who he was a translator for our government, and when our troops left and he was there, he had a target on his back, and he's literally here by himself because ISIS came in and they killed his entire family. And so he landed here and he had 90 days. He knew our language, but he had 90 days. And he has he literally lost his 2 kids. His wife was 9 months pregnant. He lost his wife too. And it's just, you know, a really hard situation. And now he has 90 days to figure it all out. And so thankfully, we've been able to come alongside and encourage him and help him kind of take some next steps towards you know, getting a job and some different things like that. But honestly, like what he really needs right now, and we talked last week, is just, he's like, hey, can we just go hang out and have lunch together and talk a little bit more? Because there's a lot of stuff that he has. I mean, it's going to take him a long time to get through some of the stuff he's gone through, and he just needs someone to give him a hug sometimes and just say, hey, we're here for you. Like as a church, like we want you to know that like the doors of our church are always open to you, and whatever we can do to come alongside and encourage you and help you is important. I think the other thing too is, you know, we saw just the power of prayer when we were in Greece, and just what happens. Man, we had people coming to us that were they were always asking for different ways that we can pray for them, and they were always in a wild way. I mean, they were talking about this man in white that kept showing up in their dreams. And they were like, hey, who is this guy? Can you help us understand who this person is? And and being able to just pray for them, but also to encourage them and to help point them to Jesus in ways that I think could be helpful and encouraging. Yeah, it's good. So just pray and ask that God would guide and lead you, and put an arm around them and care for them, and listen to them is really, really important.
Oh, Christina, I think you're muted.
There you go. Okay. I just want to say that I do agree with what Annie and Nate are saying. And the one thing that was kind of big, at least for in my own life, was that somebody invested in that of my parents when my parents came as refugees. And so if you just take that time to, open your home, maybe give them a ride to the store, or, just take them to that English class, like they were saying, those little steps really do help. And it just helps to know that somebody cared, somebody invested. And without that investment, then I know that my parents wouldn't be where they are. I wouldn't be where I am today. So, little steps like that.
Gosh, it's such a powerful reminder, honestly, that relationship is so key, right? And that's what the world of youth ministry is founded on. The idea that we would be those crazy people that pursue relationships with kids, right? And the same thing goes for the oppressed, the person who's part of an immigrant population or a refugee population. And so that's, again, if we, in these moments where we feel such political tension and we're involved in so many polarizing Facebook feed things, right? Like, we can come back to the central idea that we can pursue relationships, and God is in the midst of that, and we can join God in that work. So is there any final thing that you, Christina, Nate, or Annie would want to add before we close out? Perfect. Well, I really appreciate y'all again taking the time today. It's been invaluable for me, and I'm grateful for the incredible work that each of you are doing in your own circles and your own ministries, and the way that you're impacting the communities around you. If you are watching this and wondering what you can do next, our sister ministry, YouthWorks, is putting together a list of continued reading, some learning experiences, and other options that will help you with the practical side of implementing some of these first steps of relationships and pursuing those things. So keep an eye out for that on the blog. And with that, I will just sign off one last time by saying thanks so much for watching.